to interrelated dimensions. So moving from the micro level, so looking at firms individually, to the meso level, this will be the country, and then to the macro level, this will be for the entire world. And then we also move along a second dimension from firm preferences to their behaviors, such as lobbying, and then to policy outcomes. And this will be looking at whether or not two countries will actually sign a PTA. So today, since I'm giving a talk here at the EAI, I will primarily focusing on the first two chapters, so chapter 3 and 4. And I will be looking primarily at the evidence, both from fieldwork and from firm level survey when we conducted in China. And then if we have some time, I can possibly preview some of these findings in chapters 5 and 6, which is looking at the U.S. and then also cross-nationally. Okay, so we begin our empirical inquiry by trying to unpack the micro foundation of the theory. That is, do firms actually use these PTAs? So this is actually a really important question. It's not as obvious as you might think. And why? Because, well, if you look at PTA utilization across the, in the world, it's actually fairly low. So this is actually taken from a survey conducted by Thomson Reuters and KPMG. So they surveyed over 1,600 firms in 2016, and they asked them, are your firm fully utilizing all free trade agreements available in your country and applicable to your products? And less than a quarter of the firms actually said they were using these PTAs. So this is actually quite surprising. So countries spend a lot of time and efforts, years of negotiations, to try to come up with these agreements, and then they sign these PTAs. But it turns out that not many firms are actually using these PTAs. And then why is this? Well, if you look at existing scholarship, there's actually not that much literature looking at this particular question. So scholars have come up with a number of reasons why firms are not using these PTAs. So the first, usually people talk about the potential costs for using these PTAs. So these include administrative and financial costs. So oftentimes, in order to qualify for preferential tariff, you need to apply for the so-called rules of origin certification in order to qualify for these preferential tariff. And this is sometimes very complicated, especially when you have a very complicated supply chain relationship. So you need to certify, for example, what is the percentage of the product that is coming from the home country, and what is percentage is actually from other member countries. This is actually quite difficult because you need to have certification essentially at every step of the supply chain. And this can incur a lot of costs for firms. So that's the first reason. And secondly, it has been argued that oftentimes, because a lot of these PTAs, their scope and depth are actually quite limited. And this usually applies to PTAs signed in the earlier days. So this might, deter from actually incurring those costs to take advantage of these PTAs, because the savings from these preferential tariffs may not be that much, especially when the firms can already enjoy, close to zero tariff under the GATT and WTO, the multilateral trading system, and existing, bilateral arrangements, for example. And finally, it has been argued that sometimes the government actually plays an important role here in facilitating PTA usage. So if government can provide some kind of support, then this will actually help, especially for firms who are concerned about these administrative and financial costs. to actually look into these PTAs and make use of these agreements. So given these constraints, we want to argue that here a firm's GBC position also matters. So for multinational corporations that are more embedded in global value chains, i.e. they're more reliant on supplier-client relationship in specific countries shaped by their value chain. As I mentioned earlier, it's harder for these firms to actually shift or relocate to a third country or a different supply chain relationship, especially in the short run. And for the fact that they also benefit more from these PTAs, they should be more active users of these agreements, which in turn will lead to increased support for such agreements. So this is the first step of our theory, meaning we need to have GBC embedded firms actually using these PTAs and benefiting these PTAs, without which we can't even begin to talk about their behaviors, whether they will lobby for these PTAs, that is. So in order to examine whether this is indeed the case,